Good evening. My name is Ben Chidester. I am one of the elders here at City Reformed Presbyterian Church, and I also serve as a pastoral intern here. Well done for you all for persevering on this pilgrimage and journey to the end of the book of Joshua. We finally arrived in the promised land, or so to speak. We've made it through to the last bit of the book of Joshua. And we come here to a somewhat interesting detail that's given at the end, seeming a kind of an after or final end note, but there's much richness here in this passage to be had for us, which I hope you'll see tonight. I've included, along with the passage from Joshua, a passage from Hebrews, which helps us to see some of that spiritual significance that's going on. Hebrews, as the divine inspired commentary on the Old Testament, helps us in many passages, and this one is no exception to that. So would you read or follow along with me and give your attention to the reading of God's holy and inspired word from Joshua, the end of Joshua, and then Hebrews chapter 11. After these things, Joshua, the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And they buried him in his own inheritance at Timnath-Serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, north of the mountain of Gaash. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, and had known all the work that the Lord did for Israel. As for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem, in the piece of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. It became an inheritance of the descendants of Joseph. And Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died, and they buried him at Gibeah, the town of Phinehas, his son, which had been given him in the hill country of Ephraim. And now continuing into Hebrews chapter 11. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country. That is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. By faith, Joseph, at the end of his life, made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Oh, I am sorry. Give me just one moment here. There we go. Well, when I was in college, way back when, I went on a mission trip to China, and with a Christian fellowship, InterVarsity Christian fellowship that I was in at the time. And as part of our preparation to help us learn about Chinese culture, we watched a movie. The Chinese title is Falling Leaves Return to Their Roots, or in English, it's called Going Home. The movie is about two rural men who left their homes needing work. They were migrant workers in the city in China, but one of the friends of the two dies. And the remaining man had promised his friend that if he died, that he would take his body back home to be buried. The title of the movie alludes to that. Falling leaves return to their roots. It's based on a Chinese proverb or a saying. It conveys the idea that as we get older, there's a desire to return to a place that's familiar or to our home. It's something innate in our nature. And then when we die, we want to be even buried perhaps in the place where we're from. We don't want to be buried somewhere far away, somewhere foreign to us. We want to be buried in a place we know, in a place that's home. The movie is all about the hardship of this one man and his journey trying to get his friend's body back home, because that's where he's promised to bury him. And all along the way, he runs into troubles, which you might imagine might happen if you're carrying a dead body around on the bus or on the train. He's trying to pretend he's not dead or trying to hide what he's doing. It has a lot of actually good comic relief. It's quite funny in many spots, and I encourage it. It's good. And strangers help him carry on this task when they find out what he's doing, because they see it's good and right that a man should be buried in his home and not far away. It's a good movie if you want to get a sense also of Chinese culture. But I bring that movie up because it made me appreciate, especially as pertinent to this passage tonight, the universal significance of a place in which we're buried, especially a place that's home. In each of us, there's a longing to be buried somewhere significant, a longing that seems to transcend cultures. Even there in that movie, the whole movie is about this desire to be buried in a place that's familiar, a place that's home. Even in our culture today, in a culture where people don't seem to have much thought about an afterlife or believe that there's an afterlife, in our modern, materialistic, scientific world, there's still a care about where we're buried. People still care about it, even though rationally there might not be any reason why it should matter once you're gone, where your body is laid in the ground. How do you reconcile that longing, the desire to be buried, the desire for an abiding connection to home, even after this life ends, and yet, on the other hand, the impermanence of this life? For those of us who believe in Christ, who have put our hope in Jesus and in his resurrection, we can recognize that longing, it points us to something. It's there for a reason. The desire for rest, desire for rootedness, even beyond the grave, right? It points us to something, and we know something about that. And our passage this evening with the burial of Joshua and Joseph and Eleazar helps us to understand something about that longing and the hope to which it points. And it reminds us, as we come to the conclusion of Joshua, it reminds us that we who have put our hope in Christ and in the power of his resurrection, it reminds us that we're pilgrims and sojourners here on this earth, and that our true home isn't here. It's not Pittsburgh or the land of Canaan, but beyond the grave, in our eternal promised land to which we're going. We have to remember that. We have to keep that mentality in mind, that we are sojourners here, that this world is not our permanent abiding home, but rather the home to which we are going is where we long to be. So let's dive into these passages tonight and see how that is brought forth in the burials that we read about of Joshua and Joseph, and the accompanying interpretation that we find in Hebrews. So if we look at the passage in Joshua, this passage is in some ways a bittersweet ending to the story of Joshua, if you think about it. It ends with the burial of these men, Joseph, Eleazar, and Joshua, in the Promised Land. It's a sweet ending in that it ends with the Israelites having conquered much of the Promised Land. They're right on the cusp of completing that conquest and the fulfillment of that promise God had made to them for this land, right? The promise he had made so many generations ago. There's a sweetness to it, a triumph and victory, but it's also bitter. It's bitter in that it reminds us that many of those who had gone before, who had longed so greatly for that promised land and fought and strove for it, didn't get to enjoy that land in an abiding and permanent sense. Joshua, the first one we read of here in verse 29, as he was 110 years old, was buried in his inheritance. Joshua, the man who had led Israel through all the fierce battles, right, at Jericho, at Ai, he had been there leading the charge the whole way. Now at the end of his life, only now does he really abide in that inheritance in any permanent way. Only upon his death. So Eleazar. And this bittersweetness is felt especially, I think, in the story of Joseph, which I think is part of why he's mentioned here. Verse 32. As for the bones of Joseph, which the people of Israel brought up from Egypt, they buried them at Shechem, in the piece of land that Jacob bought from the sons of Hamor. In the story of Joshua, Joseph hasn't been mentioned yet, so we might not understand the connection here, or we might miss the significance of this moment. That's kind of an end note to the end of the story. But the story of Joseph's bones is significant for two reasons. It's a story of one promise fulfilled and another one that's seemingly left open. Joseph was the great-grandson of Abraham, a descendant, an heir of the promise that God had made to Abraham, the promise of this land that they're in, the promise of the land of Canaan. And Joseph grew up there. If you go back to read in Genesis about Joseph's life, he was raised there. But if you remember his story, he was cruelly taken from the land and died in the foreign, distant land of Egypt, never really getting to know this land that had been his promise, never really getting to know it as his home. You may know about some of these details from the story of Joseph and his robe of many colors. If you're familiar with it. It was made into a musical in the 60s. Music by the famous Andrew Lloyd Webber, who did Phantom of the Opera and all those things, right? People know about the Joseph and the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. You might know about the story from that. Just a little recap. He was the son of Jacob, who was the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. And when he was young, he dreamed dreams, which got him into trouble with his brothers, who sold him into Egypt very cruelly, where he lived out the rest of his life. But it was through his dreams that he managed to rescue not only Egypt, but most of the world from famine at the time. And even his brothers then, in the end, are brought into Egypt. They're driven there by famine, right? And because they need to buy grain, and they're met with Joseph. There's a reuniting and reconciliation between them. It's a beautiful story of God's providence working through even bad intentions. But despite all of this, all the hardship that Joseph experiences in his life, of being cruelly sold into slavery, right, being a prisoner, and then having to work for Pharaoh, despite all of this, he still hoped in God's fulfillment of this promise that God had made to Abraham, right, that to you and your descendants I will give this land. He still believed in that promise, even when he was nearing the end of his life. When he was about to approach death, he made his brothers promise him that they would ensure that his bones would one day be buried back in the land of Canaan, the land of promise. We read about it here in Genesis. You can follow along with me if you want in the additional scripture. The very end of Genesis chapter 50, verses 24 to 25. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. Joseph perhaps didn't know how that was going to be brought about, but he believed that God would be faithful somehow to bring his people back to a promised land. He spent his life as a sojourner in a foreign country, probably wondering, will I ever see that land again? Right? Yet he still believed God would be faithful somehow. And in fact, this sojourning nature that we see in Joseph's life is not just of Joseph, but it's true of all of his fathers, all the way back to Abraham himself. If you remember, God called Abraham out of Ur in the Middle East, brought him to Canaan, and he said to him, this land I will give to you and your descendants after you. Yet Abraham never actually owned any land there, if you think about it. He never actually had a permanent possession there. He only ever dwelt there as a sojourner. He had to roam around. He had to flee at different times. The only land he actually did own one small piece of land. It was a field with a tomb that he had bought to bury his wife, Sarah. And it was the same tomb in which he was later buried. That was all that Abraham, the man of faith, the heir of the promise, that's all that he ever had as possession in that land, was his own burial ground. And his son Isaac also never actually owned any land in the land of Canaan. He just dwelt there like a sojourner, like his father, and was finally buried in the same tomb as his parents. And then we come to Jacob, the father of Joseph, who also lived as a sojourner in the land of Canaan. He did purchase a piece of land we can read about in Genesis, where he pitched his tent for a time, but he was driven away from it, never to return to it. And for the rest of his life, he sojourned in Canaan, and then to Egypt, where he had to go during the famine. And there's a There's a profound moment when Pharaoh asks him, "How old are you?" To Joseph, or to Jacob. And Jacob says, "The years of my sojourning are such and such." He doesn't say, "I'm this many years old," but he says, "The years of my sojourning are such and such." Even he viewed his life as one of sojourning, knowing that he had that promise of a land, and yet the reality that he was just a sojourner here. All of these men, we're going back from Joseph all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, these men of faith, these exemplars for us, right? They never actually enjoyed the goodness of a permanent home in the land of Canaan. They never dwelt in that good land in a permanent, abiding way. Imagine someone promised you waterfront property in Greece or Italy somewhere, right? And you go there and you leave your belongings behind and you go to there and you see the property, but you only ever given a tourist visa, right? And you're never actually able to live there permanently, and you have to go from hotel to hotel, right, outstaying your stay, and you keep moving from place to place, and then you have to leave the country to renew your visa just so you can come back, right? But someone's promised you this land, but you've never really given it permanently, as if it was your own to live there, right? That's a very different experience than the experience of actually owning beachfront property in Greece or in Italy, wherever it be. That was kind of like the experience of these men of faith, these men of promise. Which is why this story is somewhat bittersweet at the end, as we're reminded of that. Of these men who had gone before, who had longed for that land, but only ever dwelt there in an abiding way in their death. So how do we resolve that tension? How do we reconcile God's promise with their experience? Was God not faithful to his promise to them? They don't seem to express discontent as we read their stories, right? And when death came, they didn't cry out against God asking, "Where is my inheritance in this land?" Why were these exemplars of faith deprived of the goodness and joy of an abiding inheritance in that land? Well, thankfully, we have some help in such a perplexing situation from the author of Hebrews. If we read the passage in Hebrews chapter 11 here, it sheds some light onto what was going on in the hearts and minds of those men. Starting at verse 13. These, that is all those patriarchs, all those men, all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak thus make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. That line, verse 16, is so key. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. We don't know what sense they had of the resurrection, of life after death. But somehow they knew, the author of Hebrews is telling us, they knew that the land of Canaan wasn't that final promise for them. That there was something more, even beyond the grave. And I don't know how far they were able to seek, to look, to see the work of Jesus on the cross and his resurrection. I'm not sure how much of that they had in their mind or were able to grasp. But I think they could have had a sense of what God was promising them by looking backward. By looking backward all the way to the beginning, to the Garden of Eden, to the home that God had originally made for Adam and Eve, to its goodness, to his dwelling there with them, and importantly, its abiding nature, or at least God's intention for it. God's desire to dwell with his people in a good and fruitful land in a secure and a permanent and abiding way. That was God's intention originally, right? And they could look back at the home that God had made in the garden for man and look at the land of Canaan and the death and the sorrow and the sadness that was still there, and they could know that this can't be ultimately what God is calling me to. This can't be the ultimate fulfillment of this promise. There must be something more, even beyond the grave. I think Calvin's comments on this tension that they must have felt is very helpful here. And I'll read what he says as he comments on this passage in Hebrews and the tension that these men of faith were feeling. Calvin says this: if these holy fathers expected a happy life from the hand of God, and it is undeniable that they did, they viewed and contemplated a different happiness from that of an earthly life. They had been, he says, duller than blocks, Calvin puts it in his witty way, in so pertinaciously pursuing promises, no hope of which appeared on the earth, if they had not expected their completion elsewhere. The thing which the author of Hebrews especially urges, and not without reason, is that they called this world a pilgrimage, as the book of Genesis also relates. If they were pilgrims and strangers in the land of Canaan, where is the promise of the Lord which appointed them heirs of it? It is clear, therefore, that the promise of possession which they had received looked farther. Hence, they did not acquire a footbreadth in the land of Canaan, except for a burial ground, thus testifying that they hoped not to receive the benefit of the promise till after death. And this is the reason why Jacob set so much value on being buried there, that he took Joseph, bound by oath, to see it done, and why Joseph wished that his bones should some ages later, long after they had moldered into dust, be carried thither. In short, it is manifest that in the whole course of their lives, they had an eye to future blessedness. The only land these men ever possessed, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, as we read here, and even Joshua, the only land they ever possessed in Canaan was a burial ground. Why did they want to be buried there? Why do we seek to be buried in the place which we grew up, or our home, or where we lived out our days? Especially for us as Christians, what are we saying when we ask to be buried in a certain place, when we long to be buried somewhere? Is it because we want to be raised back in that place? In Pittsburgh? If that's how it works, I don't know how the resurrection will work, but if it worked that way, I might want to be buried, in Hawaii. I can ship my body there, so I can be raised there instead of Pittsburgh. But I don't think that's what we're saying when we pick a choice of a place to be buried in, right? I think what we're saying when we choose to be buried in the place we grew up or the place that was our home, where we spent our days, is that when this life is over, we want to go home. We want to be home. When this life is over, with all its hardships and its trials and its sadness, when our sojourning is finally done, we just want to go home. To our permanent home, our eternal home, a home from which we'll never be exiles again. A home that's secure, that's abiding, that's permanent. And the closest approximation that we know of, that we can think of in this life, are the places we were raised and where we lived. When we rest from our labors here, that's the kind of place we want to go, a place that's home. And I think that that's what all of these fathers in the faith were longing for too. When they asked to be buried in the land of Canaan, the land of promise, I don't think that they believed that they would be raised up in the land somehow or something. Rather, I think that they wanted to go home, to the eternal home to which the land of Canaan was promising them, was pointing them. The land that had typified their heavenly, eternal promised land. Friends, we were not made to be sojourners, wandering about from place to place. We were made to have homes, a permanent and abiding home. But ever since our first ancestors sinned and Adam and Eve fell in the garden, we have been living in exile as sojourners with no permanent abiding place. And sojourning has characterized the life of God's people ever since. We've come to the end of Joshua, the end of our story of the conquest of the land of Canaan. And you might think that the point of this whole story now is that finally God's people have a permanent home, right? That's what we've been leading to. Or you might think that. Right? That they're no longer strangers and aliens on the land. They're not captives in Egypt anymore. They have their own land and home. But the story of Joshua's bones here at the end recalls to our minds that his life was one of sojourning, as was Jacob's, as was Isaac's, and Abraham's. It reminds us that this land, even though they have acquired it finally, it was not the permanent home of God's people. All it was ever meant to be was a pointer, an earthly image of that eternal land to which we are on pilgrimage, and to direct our thoughts and our longings, the longings of our heart to that eternal land. Both we, living in the New Testament era now, and God's people in the Old, we are all sojourners. Ever since we were exiled from our home in Eden, we as God's people have been sojourners, pilgrims on our way to our eternal promised land. And as I close here with some applications, I want to just flesh out the importance of maintaining this mentality as we come to the close of Joshua, the importance of maintaining this pilgrimage, sojourning perspective. Just a few brief applications. For one, this sojourning mentality resolves the tension I raised at the beginning of the sermon. The tension between the longing for a permanent home that we all have innately, the longing for something of a home beyond even the grave, and the impermanence of this life. The sojourning mentality resolves that tension. It affirms that we as Christians, it affirms for us the goodness of homes, but the goodness of rootedness in this life. It's a good thing. I think we feel that. We all feel that. Because that's what we were originally made for. We were made for rootedness in a home with the Lord. While at the same time, we can recognize that we cannot find that home in this world. Right? And we can only find it ultimately in that eternal home to which we're going. So we can affirm the goodness of homes while also facing the challenge of the possible call to journey ourselves very far from our original homes in this world. For some of you, that may be or might have been being a missionary across the world. You know what it's like to be far from a home, to be in a place that's foreign. Or you may know that one day. Right? Or maybe you grew up in a countryside and now you're living here in Pittsburgh and it feels different from you, from the place you grew up in, the place that seems natural to you. But perhaps you've taken on a job here and you want to live here because you want to be a witness in the city that needs Christ. Or maybe some of you want to be a witness in the academic world, which may call you to move away from the home, away from things that are familiar, right? Somewhere else in the country so that you can follow that call. Or you might be called to move for a job for the simple but significant reason just to provide for your family. That might be the call that takes you away from a home. It's hard doing that, leaving behind our homes. It doesn't feel good inside. It feels like something is wrong. And we can affirm that as Christians because we're not meant to be sojourners. But then we remember that this has been the lifestyle of God's people all throughout Scripture. That is the characteristic of the life of God's people, of a sojourner, ever since the fall. And we can grieve that challenge, the challenge of having to leave homes in this life, and affirm that that's not how it's supposed to be. But we can also be comforted by the hope that we will one day have an abiding home. That longing is good. It's not just one that we can feel it's just not one that we can feel the satisfaction of this life. The second point is that maintaining this mentality also helps us with contentment in this life. Having that sojourner mentality helps us with contentment in this life. As we reflect on the lives of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph here in this story, and we remember that they were deprived of ever experiencing the goodness of abiding in the land of Canaan in a permanent sense, we're reminded that the life of a sojourner is one of being deprived of some good things in this life. Whether that is the goodness of being rooted in a physical home or other things. It could be marriages for some. It could be children. Whatever those things might be, we're reminded that God does not deprive us of any eternal good things. Even though he deprived these men of faith of the enjoyment of a permanent home here in this world, in the land of Canaan, the land of promise, which they had hoped, he didn't deprive them of the enjoyment of that eternal abiding home to which it was pointed. And lastly, if you're feeling that maintaining this sojourner pilgrim mentality is hard, which it is, and I feel that it is. I don't know if it's just me, but I feel it's hard to maintain the mentality of a sojourner. One application we can take away from this text, which seems kind of morbid, but is meditating on our death. Being reminded here of Joseph and Joshua that in this life we might not experience the fulfillment like they did not of these good things, and that it comes to an end. Our society around us prefers to ignore death, to forget about it. And when it comes, we try to sweep it under the rug, right, and get on with our lives. When a funeral, even of a loved one, comes, we're distressed by how it will pull us away from work and tasks and toil, right? We need to get over it and just to move on. That's the attitude that we can imbibe from our society, rather than appreciating that this is not only a time to grieve, which is right, and a time for comfort to us, but it's also a chance for us to reflect upon the reality of death. The impermanence of our lives, that one day, unless the Lord returns first, our lives too will come to an end. In the Psalms, David says, to teach me the number of our days, I may gain a heart of wisdom. Or it might be Moses, actually. It's in the Psalms, one of the two. Psalm 90, Moses, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Also, I recommend to you this little booklet on the Christian life by Calvin. It is a section of his Institutes on the Christian life. It's very readable, very small. We have copies over there on the bookshelf, I believe. Very, very readable. But much of his attitude on the Christian life is reminding us that we're pilgrims and calling us to reflect upon our mortality as part of being reminded of our call as Christians, as sojourners. So if you want to dive further into that and get help in having that mentality, I highly recommend that book, Calvin on the Christian Life. So as we come to a conclusion here, the conclusion of our series in Joshua, remember that the main purpose of this journey into the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, was not the end goal of Canaan itself. The purpose of this conquest was not simply to have an inheritance in this world and that's the end. Right? It was meant to point both them and us to something more. The purity that God required of that land was meant to point us toward the holiness of heaven. The goodness of that land was meant to point us toward the goodness of heaven and God's dwelling there with his people. In the tabernacle, later the temple, was meant to point us to his dwelling with us in that eternal abiding land. But the land of Canaan wasn't the end. It was meant to be an image of where we're all going. But also remember the great Joshua whom we serve, who's been leading his people all the way through. That he was meant to point us to someone greater. Not just to Joshua, who's a hero in here, who fights battles and is a fierce warrior, although he's admirable for that, but to our great Joshua, who shares the same name with him, Jesus, who not only pushed out most of the land in which we were to go, but cleared it all. He removed every obstacle, every opponent, every enemy who would stand between us and that land to which we're going. He secured our entrance into it and our inheritance. And it's through him now that we, one day, when this life is over, when our bones are laid to rest in the ground, we'll cross that Jordan ourselves, the river of death, and enter into that promised land, our eternal abiding home, to be with him forever. Would you pray with me?